Hey folks, welcome back. So it's October and you know what that means. Halloween's coming up. So I thought this month we'll take a look at my raft of horror games that I have in my RPG collection. And where better to start than with my favorite RPG system, Call of Cthulhu, 7th edition. And in this case we're looking at a wonderful setting book, Regency Cthulhu, Dark Designs in Jane Austen's England, written by Andrew Peregrine, Lynn Hardy, and friends. I have to say this is a wonderful supplement. You can see it's got fantastic cover art as well. Got some red-tinted individuals in period costume in front of a sort of country estate in the early 19th century England type setting, and around them are horrible tentacles grasping onto them through the brambles and the hedges here. So it sets the mood right away. And if we take a quick look at the back, so it says, Regency England, a time of social niceties, grand balls, romantic intrigues, and disappointments, as described in the novels of Jane Austen. Yet through the lens of the Cthulhu Mythos, horrors weave themselves into the hearts of everyday Georgians, from the richest to the poorest. Step into the Regency Era and work to uncover the dark secrets of the heart of the town of Terryford. Twisted terrors that have lain dormant for centuries now seek to burst forth into England. Regency Cthulhu, Dark Designs in Jane Austen, England is a historical sourcebook for Call of Cthulhu. Inside, you'll find details on Regency Era England, which is from about 1811 to 1820, rules for creating Regency Era investigators, along with period-appropriate skills and occupations, a detailed primer on the fictional town of Terryford for use as a campaign setting in both 1813 and 1913, and 2 scenarios with handouts and maps designed to introduce players to the Regency Era and the mysteries of Terryford, new rules for character reputation and estates, as well as Regency Era equipment and weapons, and 6 pre-generated Call of Cthulhu investigators and 6 Pulp Cthulhu investigators ready to pick up and play. So there's quite a bit of stuff in here. It fills up at about 256 pages, and it's quite economical in that way. They pack a lot into not a whole lot of space. Some of you may have heard, given the recent Emmy Awards, that a fan-made supplement for Regency Cthulhu called Hosts and Hostilities actually won an award, and I can say that I can vouch for that. I played through all 3 of those scenarios with my mum, actually, who's really interested in the Regency period, and she loves Jane Austen, and so this turned out to be the perfect gateway to get her into role-playing games via Call of Cthulhu. So we played through all 3 scenarios in that fan-made supplement, Hosts and Hostilities, and I would highly, highly recommend it. They're designed for a solo player and a keeper, although you could extend them to include more than one player if you want. They're done with a high degree of production value. The scenarios are a lot of fun. There's lots of interesting things to discover, and they also work really well as an introduction to the game. They sort of increase in complexity as you go through the 3 scenarios, culminating with sort of a grand finale. But you can play them in any order if you want. But I would say if you play them in order that they're printed, you'll get the most out of it. So I've had a bit of experience with the supplement, in other words, and so that's why I wanted to show it off first. Not much going on in the end papers, just brownness. But inside, there's a lot of joy to be had. So we have a couple of fencers here, along with the publication information. This is a recent release, so it just came out last year. There's a lot of hype in the build-up to this one. I do seem to have a little bit of sort of paper hanging off the ends here, just for the first few pages. I don't know what happened. Some kind of printing error, I suppose, but no big deal. Book still works fine. Does what it's supposed to do. And of course, I bought it from chaosium.com directly, so I have a PDF version. It also gives you separate PDFs for the player handouts, pre-generated investigators, and all that good stuff, which is really helpful for the included scenarios. Here we have another atmospheric bit of art. We see the marching of some redcoats here, being waved along by the upper classes of society. In the TOC, you can see that we start off with a nice and detailed introduction, actually, to Jane Austen's England and the whole Regency era. Then we get into character creation for that era, then introduce the town of Terryford, which is the campaign setting they provide. And from there, we're straight into the 2 scenarios, which are quite beefy, and we go from page 79 all the way to 168, basically. And then we have a large selection of appendices, which include your pre-gens, your equipment tables, how you can play in Terryford in 1913, so sort of pre-Great War era, collected player maps and handouts, then resources and inspiration. So if you want to get deeper into the Regency era and work some, more Jane Austen type stuff into your games, do check out the references there. Then we've got Regency era character sheets, which you can also find for free download on the Chaosium website, of course, and your index and your author biography. So they managed to pack quite a lot of information about the era into a small amount of space here, and then the 2 provided scenarios are really good. I'm not going to go into great detail. You can watch the Good Time Society channel. I'll put a link to, they did, I think, a 4-part playthrough of The Long Corridor, which was really, really funny, actually, really enjoyable, as well as being creepy. So definitely a good way to kind of judge whether you'd be into the vibe of Regency era play. So what are we looking at when we're talking about the Regency period? Well, we're talking mainly about England, Scotland is still sort of up there doing their own thing. Here they give you a nice sort of period map. We've got a bit of Ireland over here in the Irish Sea. There's some, sea monsters lurking about, of course. And it gives you the basic county divisions at that time. Yorkshire being, of course, massive. It's been subdivided since then into West Yorkshire, East Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, etc. But at the time, it was a massive, almost kingdom in its own right, all the way down to Sussex, Hampshire, Devon, Cornwall, down in the south. Most of the action for people in society, as it were, would be in the south and the southeast, and I believe that in particular Brighton, places like Salisbury, Oxford, London, of course, Cambridge, these kind of places would be typical haunts for people who were looking to see and be seen during the season when people go out for balls and promenades and so forth. In the intro here, they give you sort of a lineup of what we talked about, what's in the TOC, and then we get right into what the Regency era is about. So during the time frame, which is, it's a short period, it's just 1811 to 1820. It was a time of big political upheaval. So Britain was basically at war pretty much the whole time. So mostly against the French during the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but also on other fronts, including in India. And it's not the Victorian era, but it's kind of the prelude to it. So the technologies that we see in the Industrial Revolution will soon come to pass. And by the end of the Georgian reign, steam power is being harnessed, and there's factories and the so-called dark satanic mills of Britain's burgeoning industrial cities. In Jane Austen's England, so Britain is mostly pastoral and relatively unspoiled at that time. In 1801, only 10 years before the Regency era, the total population of Great Britain was determined by the first ever official census to be just under 10.5 million, with a little over 1 million people living in London. Compare that to today, where we have over 65 million in the country, so quite a huge difference. By the start of the Regency period, the population is beginning to spread more evenly across the countryside, and growing cities and new factories are starting to demand workers, but the idyllic image of country life rooted in the popular imagination is kind of only a reality for the wealthy. The characters of Jane Austen's novels are not normal people. They're kind of the elite. Most ordinary people would toil for long hours and live in filth and have very little money to make ends meet. They also give you a nice background of Jane Austen here and her life as well. She was quite a keen and satirical observer at the time of the sort of political norms and social norms of the era. So she's gained a lot of fame over the years for that. She was not afraid to express herself through her writings, her opinions on the life of women and the bizarre structure of high society at that time. But little is known about her private life in a lot of ways. One of the things that's important in the Regency era is the concept of the gentry. So there's no real middle class at this time, not how we understand it today. Most of the part of the population are basically destitute or poor, or they're tradespeople. So those who kind of make things or own shops, that kind of stuff. At the very top, you have the aristocracy who make money as titled landowners. They're your dukes, your barons, your earls, and all that kind of stuff. And between the working class and the aristocracy, you have the gentry. So they kind of sort of overlap with the lowest end of the aristocracy, and they were about the top 6% of the population. They might not have a title, but they do own land, so they don't have to work. So they were often called the landed gentry. You may have heard that in your history books before. So through that land, they would, collect rent from tenants and tithes from farmers, as well as, mining if they had resources on the property and stuff like that. So they had a lot of time on their hands, basically. They didn't have to work. They just sort of were parasitic on the backs of the working class, which sounds familiar to today as well. And so they spent a lot of time on fashion, on, going out there and, as I said, trying to be seen and developing sort of norms around the development of marriages and, all this kind of stuff that we've seen in the novels and in things like Bridgerton and so forth. So during the Regency era, the gentry are kind of in crisis because there's a new kind of merchant class that is rising. So people are starting to make money as traders, and they're able to buy some of the same fine clothes and houses and stuff that the gentry had previously had. So these kind of nouveau riche are kind of starting to join the upper echelons of society. So the gentry, in turn, they start to construct Byzantine sort of etiquette rules to try and help spot people that aren't supposed to be there, in their opinion. So that's where we get into this kind of introductions and formality sections, the roles of women and so forth. The Regency era is characterized by this kind of complicated etiquette. So you would never refer to anyone, for example, by their first name. They would always be Mr. something or Miss something. Only family members might be so informal, and even then only with the younger people than themselves. Gentlemen might refer to their close male friends by just a surname, and some ladies would use first names in private, but never, ever, ever in public. So this was intended to show respect and reinforce social status. So if you're using a first name, that assumes a level of familiarity that may not be mutual. It also ignores the titles and honorifics of whoever you're speaking to, which are really important to people in the landed gentry and in the aristocracy. So if you don't show respect due to their title, people would be insulted, and all kinds of faux pas could result. So you're also not allowed to speak to anybody unless you've been formally introduced. So this is an interesting part that came up quite a bit in my games using this setting book. So my mother was playing a female character, and in order for her to talk to anyone, she had to grab somebody she knew and ask them who knew that person that you wanted to speak to, and sort of through a chain of introductions, eventually be able to get into a conversation with them. But again, it was about kind of keeping the unwanted elements out of the gentry. Basically, somebody has to open the door for you to get into this part of the world and to be accepted. You can't just show up and start talking to people and be friendly. People will pretend you don't exist if you haven't been formally introduced. Women at the time, basically, while they have an elevated social position and they have lots of luxuries and stuff, they don't have any real privileges. Women are carefully controlled and remain sort of firmly in the home. They can't work. They can't legally own property. Of course, there's no voting or anything like that. Women are considered innately more virtuous than men, which can play to your favor if you want to be a female criminal. However, this assumption of virtue means that if you are unvirtuous, you would pay much more of a social price if you were, drunk or did something indelicate, shall we say. So in the end, all that's left for society women is going to dances and balls, having children, and developing their sort of hobbies, which they would call accomplishments. So the most virtuous skills for a woman at the time were to have a command of languages, particularly French and German were very popular, to get involved in art, music, needlework, this kind of stuff. Being a master of any of these kind of arts would make a young woman more impressive and eligible marriage prospects. And honestly, that's all they really had to do to pass the time. Basically, given that there was lots of time to do things, a lot of women would get into reading. However, there was no point in really getting too scholarly with it because they were barred from working. So there was no point in trying to read and become, say, an academic. I mean, those professions were barred to women. During this time as well, men and women were kind of paired by their families quite often. So, a marriage for love was like something that people would wish for, but often didn't happen. People might be pushed into marriage with someone they barely know because it would help their families secure their station, or it would be somehow beneficial to their relationship. Unsuitable matches that were based on love but would be politically unsuitable or societally unsuitable were quickly kind of snapped apart. And if they weren't, then those relationships could bring about, people being publicly humiliated. You could be taken out of the will. All sorts of stuff could happen to you. And there's a lot of info here about how the actual process of getting a marriage going in Regency England would go. And it's a complicated thing. So a gentleman would have to establish himself. He must be able to provide for his wife and prove that he has an appropriate occupation. So they typically look to marry once they've reached their early 20s and they've gotten their hand into some kind of business, usually, related to their elevated social position. Women, on the other hand, would be sort of kept away hidden until they're coming out. So that'd be around age 15 or so. And then they'd come to balls and social events and dances and try to catch the interest of a suitable gentleman in the hopes of getting married. So until a woman is officially out, she's not officially able to be married to anyone. But they, of course, would be available for marriage much earlier than the men would. Basically, there was a lot of taboos attached to these male-female courtships as well. So, for example, during dances, you would get a moment to actually talk and enjoy some minimal physical contact with somebody you might be interested in. That's basically the only time you get close to one another. Every other time, you would have to be chaperoned, and if you dance too many times with the same person or you visit them a lot, people would start to talk, and they'd expect a proposal. Basically, I mean, even though you've never really been together in any sort of real way beyond at social events. And that kind of thing would be unthinkable today for most people, but that was commonplace in the Regency era. And of course, it's up to the man to do the proposing, and it's the only time that an unmarried couple can be left unchaperoned. So if a guy asks to talk to a particular lady of the house alone, then that's typically a big red flag that a proposal's coming. But then the woman has to consider the offer very carefully. Women of good birth are not supposed to work, so this man must be able to care for her and take care of all their expenses. They have to make sure that basically it's a pragmatic relationship that will work. And basically she needs to know that, at least as far as she knows, the individual concerned is a decent chap, because she's handing over everything she has to him as well as being stuck with him forever. I mean, divorce was not the done thing at the time. So she had no real choice but to kind of scrutinize these offers. Now, they also have a nice sidebar here about the issue of consent. So romance, marriage, and courtship are a big part of Jane Austen's works, but they don't necessarily need to be part of a Call of Cthulhu game. I personally think, it's quite fun to have a little bit of that in these settings. Obviously, you need to make sure that your players are into it and that you know where to draw the line. And in the period, it was quite sexually repressed, so you're never going to get into particularly saucy situations. But that kind of interesting mix of highly complex etiquette and courtship rituals and inequality between men and women, I think, is pretty rich for role-playing. So I'd advise that you do have a bit of that, and certainly the classic setting of the girl coming out at the ball and, men fighting over her or whatever is a great sort sort of plot starter and a good way to introduce some creepy undercurrents that lead into a mythos story. There's also a sidebar here about sex and sexuality. So, of course, there were LGBTQIA plus people around at that time, as in every other era of human existence. But basically, marriage was exclusively between men and women and was exclusively about the production of children. So being heterosexual and being, conforming to your gender was essential. So basically, if you were really rich, you could get away with non-conformant relationships. You might secretly have, what they called molly houses, where gay men would meet each other and they would have transgender women sometimes, or people would cross-dress, etc. But, only the most elite could get away with this, and even then they'd have to be very secretive. So it's an interesting little sidebar to the realities of the historical period. And likewise, there's a nice bit about race and ethnicity during this period as well. There were fewer women of color living in England during this period. Fewer than 20% of London's black population at this time was female, and this included the enslaved Bermudian Mary Prince, who in 1831 became the first black woman to publish an autobiography in Britain. Georgians of color could be found at all levels of society, though the vast majority were in the working class. Most of the black population were in domestic service, either freely or enslaved. Similarly, Asian immigrants who were not Lascars were also predominantly servants brought back from India. Black and people of color performers were also relatively common, so it's important to realize that society at this time even was quite diverse in a way. You did see different colors and shapes and sizes of people, but the prejudices of the time meant that there were huge disadvantages for people of color, and of course interracial marriages were kind of okay in the working classes, but racism and discrimination was never far away. So, it was always something to be aware of. And then, since we're dealing with the early 19th century, we get into some of the technical aspects. So, transport, passenger trains are not that widely available, so still you get around often by horse and carriage, and they would be long journeys, not overly pleasant. Many gentlemen would be fond of two-seater buggies with large wheels because they could get some speed out of those, and they were good for taking a young lady for a drive with the added benefit of having no space for a chaperone. Helpful at times. For weapons, generally, if you had a personal weapon at the time, your choice would be a firearm. So in the army, muskets were sort of abandoned, and now we have proper rifles, which have grooves inside the barrel to increase accuracy of the spinning projectile. Rifles, muskets, and pistols used a flintlock system where you have to stuff a ball and wadding down the barrel, so they're really slow to load, but still very dangerous in the hands of a skilled marksman. And people use pistols for dueling, so many gentlemen would keep elegantly crafted dueling pistols in their homes. So a lot of wars, especially those with the French, led to guns moved from military to civilian possession. So many coachmen or guards would also have weapons to see off, highwaymen or bandits or what have you. Of course, people had swords as well. They were generally light one-handed weapons designed for thrusting, like the rapier or épée kind of stuff. Nice sidebar here as well about British currency. At the time, the currency was not decimalized, so you have to deal with this. Shillings and pennies and stuff. 1 pound would be 20 shillings or 240 pennies, and 1 shilling is equal to 12 pennies. And prices would be quoted in pounds, shillings, and pence, written as pound/s/d. So 12 shillings would be 12s, 4 pence would be 4d, 12 shillings and 4 pence would be written as 12/4. Eventually, I think in 1977 was when currency was decimalized in Great Britain, but people stuck with the system for a really long time, well past when everybody else moved on to decimal currency. So, and there was a lot of objection at the time as well, but nowadays, you have a pound, it's equal to 100 pennies, and that's it. But yeah, it's something to get used to. Prices and so forth will work in this antiquated system, which is not decimalized. So alongside your sword carrying, you would also have knives, especially with poorer classes. You could also have bows, which are also popular with women, because archery was a pursuit that women were allowed to try. So there were some further advances in weapons and machinery and stuff that happened shortly after this era as well. They give you a nice little timeline here of sort of key events, key inventions during the period, going all the way back to George I in 1714. Continuing all the way through. So we've got, the various interactions with America and the War of Independence, French Revolution, rise of Napoleon, the War of 1812 was coming up, all that sort of stuff. British forces burning down the White House in 1814, and then we carry on here. So up until 1837, and then we get the crowning of Queen Victoria. So that's when the Victorian era kind of officially begins. But the Regency period itself officially ends when the Prince Regent is crowned King George IV after the death of his father. That brief period where we had a Prince Regent and he wasn't yet crowned king is the Regency period that we're concerned with. So how do you create a Regency Investigator? Well, basically it follows a very similar process to how you would create any character in 7th edition. And in fact, thanks to the website The Dole's House, which is now the official kind of character creation website for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, go on there and there's a Regency Investigator preset. And you can just spend your points, build an investigator, save them, print them on a nice Regency character sheet, and you're all done, which is great. And they do have these nice little bits of flavor scattered through the book as well. So pass this, to your players as a handout, just a really brief introduction to what's going on in Britain during the Regency era. So the process of generating and creating an investigator is pretty much the same as you would normally do. You generate characteristics, then your derived attributes, then you work out their occupation from the Regency occupation section. Choose the one that best fits your character concept. Then you would decide your skills. So you take your recommended skills from your occupation, and then you'd have occupational skill points, which can only be spent on the skills associated with that occupation. Then also you would need to sort of add them to the base value of the skill. Sometimes people forget to do that. It's a lot of skills have a base value that you are adding these points onto. You're not starting at 0. Also, you should assign points to credit rating based on the social class of your chosen occupation. So social class being a big part of this game, they make sure that to emphasize that. Then you calculate your investigator's int multiplied by 2, and these are your investigator's personal interest skill points, and they can be spent on any skills you like except Cthulhu Mythos, which is only supposed to be gained when you actually encounter Mythos stuff. Then you can create a backstory, calculate your cash spending level and assets, and then that determines what equipment you can reasonably own or be able to purchase. And then finally, if you're using the reputation system, which you definitely should if you're playing in this era, then you calculate the investigator's reputation points and write them down on the character sheet, and then you're ready to go. So there's quite an extensive list of Regency occupations. So the ones here with a asterisk are also suitable as a hobby career for a gentleman or gentlewoman. So in such cases, occupational skill points are calculated as per the appropriate occupation, but their position in society determines the investigator's base credit rating. So you could be, say, an artist or an author and still be a gentleman. So you would take the skills from being an artist or an author, but you would take the social class from being a member of the gentry and give yourself a credit rating appropriate to that rather than what you would get if you were just an average artist or author. And quite a few of these, notice, including occultist, are suitable for hobbies for gentlemen and gentlewomen. Some occupations for women are quite limited, so they're generally expected to look pretty, sew, and gain an education that's basically about music and foreign languages, but not really science or anything like that. Professions like doctor, lawyer, academic, those are not anything that were possible for them. Whether or not to do that in the game, of course, is up to the game master. To me, I think, if we're dealing with a fantasy version of the Regency period, then, if people would rather just not deal with that particular oppression aspect of things, I'm totally fine with it. We're not here to be simulating the Regency era. We're using it as a backdrop for horror and investigation, so I don't stick too closely to that sort of stuff. And then there's a sidebar here about if you want to enjoy the style of Regency England while pushing a little wider than Jane Austen's historical worldview, then you can look to Pulp Cthulhu rules for that. So action and adventure are the order of the day for any man or woman in this case. Genteel ladies will keep a shotgun to hand while drinking tea and may even have their own underground fight clubs where they prove their martial prowess with epee and foil. Women are free to be far more proactive in terms of adventure and relationships. So you could have a pulp version of the Regency where you forget about all that stuff and have a lot more excitement, adventure, and mixed gender action, which is pretty cool. Then they note down the new occupations. So you have, of course, gentlemen. You just do whatever you want, basically. Remember the landed gentry. You have loads of wealth and privilege, and yeah, you can do whatever you want. Your typical occupation skills will be charm, dancing, etiquette, fashion, gaming, ride. One weapon skill plus one other skill as a personal hobby. And we have the gentlewoman, which is quite similar, except the skill mix is different. A gentlewoman, it would be the daughter of a gentleman and a member of the landed gentry, and basically she's just waiting around for an appropriate partner to marry. For some, they don't mind the peace and boringness of the lifestyle, but for others, it's a huge, frustrating waste of time. So, again, up to your group, whether you think women should have a wider reach than what was officially permitted at the time. I would say go for it. It's more fun, if you can play the character that you want to play. But in terms of the rules, she gets basically the similar stuff as the gentleman, except her skills are about arts and crafts, i.e. embroidery, fine art, instruments, singing, etc. Dancing and etiquette are on there, and as well as fashion and other language, usually French, plus persuade and ride, because riding horses was also a popular hobby for women. You could be a member of the nouveau riche, so this is the new scary to the gentry class of merchants, basically traders who are coming into the aristocracy. And in that case, your skills are more on the business side of things. You've got accounting and appraising, business, fast talk. You could be a footman, if you're familiar with Downton Abbey, you've seen those before. You'll be dressed in the uniform of the house, carry luggage or heavy items around. You'll carry messages to people, help the gentleman dress, and assist in serving dinner. And the more footmen you have in a residence, the more wealthy that person tends to be. So employing a lot of footmen is also a sign of class, And the same for housemaids. So low-ranking kitchen maids would be doing unpleasant stuff in the kitchen. Housemaids see to the house by cleaning the floors, dusting the shelves, setting the fires in the fireplaces each day. Then they do the laundry, wait on the family, and often help the ladies to dress as well as serve the dinner. We've also got some new or adjusted skills. So, of course, computer use, drive, auto, electrical repair, electronics, hypnosis, pilot, psychoanalysis, operate heavy machinery, and science are not available to Regency characters because they didn't really exist in their current form at that time. But there are some new skills or skills that have been adjusted. So we have astronomy. So they give some nice examples here. Study of the heavens was understood as a way to understand God and the universe, but it wasn't a scientific study in the modern sense, and so it's not really considered a science. It's listed as a separate skill in a Regency character build. Credit rating is also adjusted to reflect kind of the strict class divisions. So in Investigator's occupational band, which we can see in these here. So occupational band 1 is a laborer or servant. The lowest of the low, basically. That sets their maximum level of credit rating. If you earn more, you might attempt to move beyond your current station, but that's not necessarily easy to do. So the player should ensure that they have enough skill points to invest to at least meet the minimum credit rating required for the occupation that they want. So if you want to be a gentleman or a gentlewoman, you need at least 50 in credit rating to meet the wealth requirements to fit that career. And they give you some examples here as well. Then there's some sidebar here about, the living standards at the time, depending on your credit rating. If you're at 0, then basically you're begging in the streets. 1 to 9%, you're poor. You have only the clothes on your back, basically, and you might live in the worst of the worst of rented accommodation. 10 to 20, you're lower class, but you can keep a basic roof over your head. 30 to 49% is an emerging middle class, or you have some kind of business or trade. 50 to 90% would be the poorer gentry end, or an established professional. So you might be one of the nouveau riche, for example, or on the lower end of the landed gentry scale. Credit rating 70 to 82% would be the average member of the gentry or a wealthy professional. So your family would have a big estate with a manor house, all that kind of stuff that you see in the period dramas. 83 to 89%, you're in the wealthy gentry, so almost in the aristocracy. You probably have relatives in the nobility. You might have world recognition or a vast estate, all this kind of stuff. If your credit rating is 90 to 100%, then you are in the aristocracy. You have land, title, and connections to the royal family directly. Anything you want is available to you, basically, and your estate is more a palace than it is a home. And then there's another sidebar here, so just pointing out where each occupational band falls in terms of the credit rating. So occupational band 1, as a laborer or servant, you fall into 9 to 30%. Shopkeepers or craftspeople between 20 and 60%. If you're a professional, you could be anywhere between 30 and 70%, depending on whether you're in a respected profession like academia or doctors, lawyers, etc. In occupational band 4, the gentry, the nouveau riche, you're between 50 and 90% credit rating. And for the aristocracy, it's only available for 90 to 100%. They note, however, that generally it's not routinely available to investigators to be at this level, but it could be very possible to run a really interesting game of Regency Cthulhu based within the aristocracy. They also recommend to keepers that if you're planning on having aristocratic investigators, just rename the gentleman, gentlewoman occupation to nobleman, noblewoman, and adjust their credit rating to the appropriate range of 90 to 100. So then we have some other new skills. So dancing, this is really important at the time because, dancing at a ball was one of the few ways you would get to meet a potential paramour, essentially. So they give some examples of when you should call for a dancing role, basically when the character wants to impress their partner or their wider company, examples of different difficulty levels, and consequences of failing a pushed role, like falling over because of drunkenness or looking like a complete arse. It says losing reputation points, all kinds of stuff. Driving carriages and carts as well with a base of 20%, so that's the replacement for drive auto. With that, you can drive any kind of carriage, basically, from small buggies with a single horse to big 4-horse coaches. For low-class characters, the skill is drive cart, but you still use it for carriages. It's the same basic idea. Again, we have another reference chart here with credit rating, the relevant description, what that means in terms of your income, your assets, and your spending level. So you can see things are very, very uneven. You might get 1 shilling a month if you're on the bottom end of the scale. You get £5,000 if you're in the aristocracy, which at the time was a preposterous amount of money. We also have the skill of etiquette, which is essential for anybody in high society, and the keeper is perfectly within their rights to demand an etiquette roll before an investigator attempts any form of social interaction to ensure they're making the correct approach. Failure leads to being ignored, and any subsequent attempts to force their company and their acquaintances prove very unwelcome. Too many failed etiquette rolls, and the character is simply not invited to any further social occasion. So yeah, this is a really big deal. And if you make a big faux pas, etiquette-wise, you can end up losing reputation points, you can be ostracized from the scene, not being invited to any balls, being removed from guest lists, etc. Yeah. You could be causing a general scene and not be invited back anymore. Fashion as well is important, but it applies just as much to men as it does to women, and in fact it says, if anything more so. Women's formal gowns are often made of white muslin in much the same style as their day wear. However, men routinely wear a variety of colors, often quite vivid ones, meaning their jackets, waistcoats, and trousers frequently stand out. Many fashion-conscious men look like peacocks, although society may think such gentlemen have taken things a little too far and refers to them as dandies, the most famous of the age being Beau Brummel. So yeah, whether you're male or female, having good fashion sense when you're in the upper scales of the landed gentry is pretty important. It's a way people can notice you, it's a way you can gain reputation, and it's a way to make sure that you keep up with the trends and that you'll be eagerly invited to the important social events. Gaming as well is useful, so if you're a male character especially, you might gamble, and drink at late night parties, which would be an important place to learn things from key NPCs perhaps. But there are card games that were played between women as well at the time. So again, there's risks involved here. You might lose reputation if you're really bad, or if you lose your temper over a game or something. You might gain an enemy if you really beat the heck out of somebody, or if you try to cheat by pushing your roll, and that's the way you want to try and win the game, well, that could be a huge problem. Mesmerism is the replacement for the hypnosis skill. Hypnosis is a great skill in the main Call of Cthulhu rules. You can do quite a lot with it if you allow that skill in a regular Call of Cthulhu game. It's not on the standard character sheet, but it can be purchased by characters as long as the GM is okay with it. Mesmerism is similar to that, and along with the Reassure skill, it's the only way to treat those suffering from mental trauma in the Regency Era. So you induce a trance-like state, causing them to experience heightened suggestibility, relaxation, and the possible recall or repression of memories. So you do an opposed roll between the mesmerism skill and the target's power psychology. Although with a willing and compliant target, the mesmerist needs only to succeed with their roll. You can only affect one target at a time, and use of this skill for devious or malign purposes should always come at the cost of sanity points. So 3 possible uses they give here: you can alleviate pain, you can suppress mental trauma, like install a mental block to help somebody, recover from sanity loss, or you could plant misinformation, like alter the memory of an NPC, supply false and misleading replies to future inquiries when that character replies to you. So it could get really confusing, actually. So you want to be careful with that. Then we have natural philosophy, so this replaces science but has no real specialization. At the time, nobody was really called a scientist. Natural philosophers were people who felt they were studying to try to understand more of God's works. It was still considered very normal that, God was the creator of heavens and the earth, and that we were just trying to figure out more about how that came to be and what that looks like, rather than trying to come up with scientific explanations or laws underlying the nature of reality. So use of the term scientist doesn't really come about until 1833. So that's why they replaced this skill and removed the specializations. Then we have the Reassure skill, because there's no such thing as psychoanalysis at the time, due to the lack of people like Sigmund Freud. But calm words and intuitive insight from a caring person can work wonders when it comes to soothing a troubled mind. So a successful Reassure roll enables the recipient to recover +3 sanity. If the roll is failed, then no sanity points are recovered, while a fumbled or failed push roll inflicts -1d6 sanity loss. So you have to be careful with this. Basically, along with mesmerism, this is the only real way to try and help somebody who's been through a lot and has suffered a big sanity loss. Then we have the religion skill. So this covers knowledge of human religions, belief systems, and mythologies, including doctrine, practice, and history of traditions. The core religion skill is sort of focused on the main religions known at the time, like Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Shinto, Sikhism, and so on, but you can choose specialisms in other things if they're outside of that category. So you might have, paganism or Cherokee or something like that. So you can use that skill to know or identify sacred spaces, join in a ritual, know the correct way to address people who are in that religion, etc. Then we have some new skill specializations. So those come about mainly through arts and crafts. But before that, there's a summary of the Regency skill list overall. The asterisks here mark the skills that have been replaced or adjusted. So, we have astronomy, dancing, drive, carriage and cart, etiquette, fashion, gaming, mesmerism, natural philosophy, Reassure, and religion are the newbies, and everything else is standard what you'd find on a COC 7th edition Call of Cthulhu sheet. So as far as specializations within art, you can specialize in things like acting, art appreciation, embroidery, fine art, forgery, music, which could have further specializations like type of instruments, poetry or sculpture. In terms of craft, it could be blacksmithing, carpentry, cooking, pottery, or sewing. For fighting, you could specialize in axes, brawls, flails, garrots, spears, swords, including like rapiers or sabers or the whip. For firearm skills, you would have bow or pistol, which replaces the handgun skill in the normal game, and rifle or blunderbuss, which replaces rifle/shotgun in the normal game. More uncommon skills. Some skills are more appropriate to certain social classes than others. So animal handling, basically, is just for the lower classes. And servants and stuff. Artillery would be available as an occupational skill for military careers. Demolitions would be a common skill for miners, but not many others. Maybe some military people. Diving is considered part of swimming. Hypnosis is not available, so you have mesmerism instead. Lore is still available, but its more mundane subjects are covered by the occult and natural philosophy during the Regency period. Piloting a boat is really rare unless you were a navyman. And reading lips is exceptionally rare, but still available with keeper's permission, particularly if the investigator is a spy, so keep that in mind. Reading lips and hypnosis, as noted by famed YouTuber Seth Skorkowski, are two really useful skills that are not on the main character sheet that a lot of people forget about, and they both can be really, really useful, but very situationally useful. But it can be useful if you have a party of characters to have somebody with hypnosis and somebody with read lips, just in case they come in handy, because being able to read lips through a closed window while a cult ritual is going on could be a really big deal that helps you out during a mystery. Then we got some optional rules as well for the Regency era. So the optional spending luck rule, they recommend using that rule all the time, and I think most people do. It's an excellent rule, and it helps to avoid the frustration of whiffing too often. So you reduce your luck points permanently in exchange for improved dice rolls, and the luck can recover gradually, but doesn't come back as fast as you would like. You can also adjust a roll's degree of success as well. So you can't spend luck, though, on push rolls, sanity rolls, or luck rolls themselves, and you can't spend them to alter the amount of like how much sanity you lose or how much damage you take or stuff like that. And if you have a fumble or a weapon malfunction, you can't use luck to buy that off. It's going to happen. So it's quite possible for you to run out of luck as well, so you have to be careful. But at the end of the scenario or beginning of a new one, Keeper should give you a chance to regain some luck. They might even allow some luck at the beginning of each session, depending on how action-packed they want the adventure to be. To refresh Investigator's luck, the Keeper should ask the player to roll against their Investigator's current luck value, and if you fail, you gain plus 1d10 luck points. But if you succeed, then it's not increased. So it's just like any other skill, basically. Now, reputation. This is a really cool part. So this is a really excellent addition to the game that really helps to tie the whole themes of the Regency era together into the main gameplay loop. So basically, each character has a reputation score. So the reputation score is determined by adding together their credit rating and etiquette skills and then dividing the result by 2. And the maximum you can have is 99. And then they give you a table down here of what those reputations mean. So if you're at 0, you're irredeemably wicked. And the difficulty level of any reputation roll is extreme. If you're between 1 and 39, you're a bad sort, and reputation rolls have a penalty die. If you're between 40 and 59, you're sort of average, respectable person, and your rolls are normal. If you're between 60 and 98, you're a credit to the ton, the high society, and your dice rolls for reputation will get a bonus die. And if you're at 99, you're basically the king or queen. You get 2 bonus dice, or you can just automatically pass reputation rolls. So reputation is intended for investigators. It's not something you should really track with NPCs. It leads to a lot of trouble for a keeper. So basically, the penalties and bonuses described in this table should be applied to skill rolls, usually social skill or credit rating, where reputation would affect it, essentially. So reputation would be used when you're, say, trying to do a credit rating roll to conduct business or to get a line of credit with some shop, or if you're trying to use a social skill to get something you want from somebody of lower station, then you would get, potential bonuses or maluses from your reputation. And then gaining or losing reputation can happen depending on when you screw up. So see if, for example, you could lose 1d2 points if you get caught kissing a paramour chastely on the cheek. 1d4 if you dress inappropriately for a social function, or if you step on your partner's toes at a ball. A big faux pas would be, failing to observe etiquette properly, like fumbling an etiquette roll. Ruining a social occasion by being clumsy or improper, sneaking around your host house, stuff like that. 1d8 would be a serious infraction, like making a proposal of marriage and breaking it, kissing a paramour in a far from chaste manner, assaulting someone, cheating at cards, etc. 1d10 would be a very serious infraction, like making a false accusation, licentious behavior, or defaulting on your creditors. And finally, 1d20 would be going even beyond that. So defaulting on your creditors and fleeing the country, public drunkenness and debauchery, getting caught doing murder or being found guilty of murder, having sex outside of wedlock, all that kind of stuff, your reputation would plummet by 1d20 points. So it actually, when you combine it with this table where it really affects your social skills and your ability to get things done, reputation works really well to really make you pay attention to things like, oh God, I need to think about this person's social station. Am I going to get a proper formal introduction? I need to make sure I don't fail my etiquette roll and that I approach them properly. Otherwise, my investigator investigation will be hampered, my social skills will be hampered, my reputation could drop, and that could lead to long-term consequences as well as short-term inconveniences. And if you do really badly, so basically, if you lose 1/5 of your starting reputation points in a single day, you get censured by society and get a penalty die on all applicable skill rolls. If you're already susceptible to a penalty die, then you get an additional penalty die for a maximum of 2. So, and if you were a credit to the ton, so you had a +1, bonus die, then that gets canceled out and you go back to normal rolls. So censure, basically the only way to get out of it is to gain reputation points. So the way you gain reputation points is by conforming to or exceeding society's expectations. So if you get an extreme success or better on an etiquette roll, you get +1d6 reputation. A heroic or noble act will get +10 points, like if you save someone's life or protect their honor, particularly if it appears to be at the expense of your own. Basic ways of gaining and losing reputation are pretty sensible, like, if you protect a woman from a drunken and licentious man's behavior, then you will gain points. People will view you more positively. So there are ways to come back from a reputation loss or even from censure, but it does set you back significantly, and that could lead to the end of the world. This is Call of Cthulhu we're talking about. There's other uses of reputation as well, so you can use it to spread gossip. And if you have a successful reputation roll, and when you spread gossip, then people are more likely to believe you, and that could then cause somebody else to lose reputation, for example. However, if you fumble that roll, maybe it seems they believe you, but later they out you as spreading false gossip and you lose reputation, for example. So there's risk associated with these other uses as well. You can also try to bolster somebody's reputation. So you try to give somebody some extra 1d6 reputation points by praising their actions. It should only be allowed once per scenario is a suggestion, because otherwise players could abuse it. And of course it would require a successful reputation roll to do that. So if that is a fumble, then maybe, you have some negative consequences as well. If your investigators are part of the landed gentry, then your players will like a few more options when it comes to the grandeur of their family estate. So they give a little table here. You can roll on the table to determine their estate standards, from poor, which is a small estate, or one overcrowded with children, the small manor house and a few tenants on the land. Comfortable would be better income and it looks quaint instead of small. Charming would be good social standing, but you can't have big gatherings there. It'd be more for small, intimate parties. 4, you get a large home, which is stately home, but it's more historical in value rather than being, comfortable and sizable. You can have larger social events, but it's not sort of durable enough for too many. At a 5, you get an impressive estate, but it's impeccably maintained, and you'd be expected to host gatherings at this kind of home because it's very impressive. Finally, you could have a grand estate, so it would be a very large estate with huge grounds and land. The family would be one of the wealthiest in the area, and if you were part of the local Terryford setting, which is in the next chapter, then you might even be rivals to the Northlake family for control of local society. And then we get a nice little overview of the Regency Cthulhu Investigator sheet. You can see it's basically the same as a normal one, except we have a different border, we have the Regency Cthulhu logo, and we have an additional space here for reputation, and that includes a little tick box if you've been censured, and the appropriate skills have been changed over, so, you have dancing and drive carriage and astronomy and natural philosophy and all that kind of stuff. So it's basically the few changes that you need to make to the core rules are made for you. And again, if you go to the doleshouse.org, and you can create a Regency Cthulhu character from scratch there very easily. Finally, we get to Chapter 2, so this is about Terryford. This is a default kind of setting. I didn't use this for Host and Hostility because that was set in kind of London and Southampton and Brighton, I believe. And those are places I'm familiar with in real life, so I just kind of, read a little bit about history and sort of faked it until I made it, basically. But this is a really nice detailed little setting in the county of Wiltshire in the southwest of England. So it's somewhere between Bath and Salisbury, basically. It's a landlocked county. As you can see, it's a lovely little place. Outside of Terryford, the land is basically mostly fields and estates. Most of the estates are occupied by members of the gentry, and the most notable one is that of the Northlake family. So it's the oldest in the area and dates back centuries. And some very small villages of fewer than 100 working-class country folk dot the surrounding area, the nearest being Bungford. These villages usually have just a church, a scattering of homes, and possibly a blacksmith. Most folk will come to Terryford for local supplies and so forth. The population is around 1,000 people, and about 800 of those resident in the town proper, and the rest are living on the neighboring estates and farms. But it has pretty much what you'd expect for a nice country town. Got a sort of main crossroads in the middle, got shops and pubs along these main streets, which is called the High Street by the locals. It's a quiet and pleasant place for the most part, though it does have a fair few rougher elements on the seamier side of town. There are a few local industries and craftsmen, and rather than the church, the Four Feathers pub is the heart of Terryford, basically. And a few claim the pub is the reason for some of the town folks' low moral character, but that's something to get into in the included adventures. If the investigators are members of the local landed gentry, then you can give them their estates located close to Terryford. But if not, they could be, members of the nouveau riche or the servant class or worker class or whatever living in town. Regardless, if you're going to use this setting, the investigators are assumed to be locals, and so they know the area, the businesses around there, and the local well-known people pretty well. So most purchases made by the gentry, if you're wandering around town, are going to be spent on credit, and basically so you spend money by adding your purchases to the family account. It's considered insulting for a lesser member of society to demand payment from their betters, as it suggests that a gentle person doesn't have the money. But this can be a real problem, of course, if you're a tradesman, because it's disrespectful to ask for your payment and you're giving away all these expensive goods that you've made with your hands on credit. But they could also just refuse to keep adding to your tab after a while. So there is a way for them to kind of cut people off after a certain point. So then we have some details about other aspects of Terryford life. So we've got the Four Feathers Pub, which is kept by Mr. Garrett Copeland, who's a publican. We can see him here. He's a sturdily built white man with well-developed arm muscles from handling beer barrels. He's chatty and friendly with a submissive streak, and he's an inveterate gossip and good source of information. And he's got his stats over here as well. Then we've got Alice Copeland, age 39. That's his wife here. They've been married for over 20 years, and she's a stereotypical picture of a pub landlord's wife, well-built with rosy cheeks and sparkling blue eyes that miss very little. She also has a prominent strawberry birthmark over the bridge of her nose. Then we also have Solsmith's Bakery, which is run by Mr. Morris Solsmith, age 58, and this is him. Bit rotund, but he likes his sweet treats. What can you say? He's large in both a fat and muscular way. He's opinionated, stubborn, and privileged. Then we have Mrs. Sarah Saltsmith, who's a few years younger, but looks quite grumpy herself. She married Saltsmith because she liked the idea of a big, strong man who knows his own mind. But as time has gone on, the reality has proven less than desirable. So basically, he doesn't do much in either the business or the marriage, and Sarah does most of the work. So that tends to fray on the happiness of their marriage from time to time, as you might imagine. Saltsmith herself is an angry woman, driven that way by her husband. Then we have Johnson's Blacksmiths and Carriage House. So there we have Mr. Martin Johnson, age 22, a blacksmith and farrier. He's muscular and strong, with movie star good looks and a physique to match. He's an arrogant and attractive Lothario. Every week he has a new girl, and quite the reputation. There's always a twinkle in his eye, and any female investigator would do well to make sure they're never left alone with him, unless they want to be, of course. There's also Mr. Benjamin Johnson, who is the apprentice blacksmith at age 19. He's exceptionally uncomfortable with attention. He's no less attractive than his brother, but always feels he's everybody's second choice. Poor guy. He's much like his brother Martin, but has a kinder face. And he's a shy and respectful young man harboring a severe case of possible unrequited love for Miss Clara Potterton. But she's a member of the gentry, so out of reach for him. And here we have their stats and some pictures as well. A lovely map here of Terryford, which is quite practical and easy to read. We can see all the key locations here, the Four Feathers, the bakery, the alehouse, blacksmith, apothecary, and the church, etc. And then some additional important areas for the keeper to note, abandoned houses, underground chambers, and so forth. And going on, we have the Banham's Ale House. There's no accommodation here, but it does offer food at lunch and dinner time. Decent but simple, usually a stew and lamb chop and mashed potatoes or something like that. Run by Mr. John Banham, age 62, with his stats down here, and a nice picture. He's got quite some sideburns there. He's got thick side whiskers and a full head of pepper and salt hair. His wide smile is welcoming, but his eyes cannot completely hide the loneliness within. Poor guy. He's never without a drink in his hand, warm and sociable, and ever ready with a tale to tell. Yeah, deep down he's quite lonely. Then we have Fortham's Drapers. So they're the largest fabric shop in Terryford, and they offer everything a lady might wish for when shopping for material. Most women buy fabric themselves before engaging a dressmaker, so they would go to the drapers first, buy the materials they want for the dress, and then take to the dressmaker to put it together. Run by Miss Millicent Fortham. That's a very old school name, Millicent. She's been married for nearly 50 years, but few people have ever seen Mr. Fortham. It's interesting. We also have Miss Harriet Fortham, age 32, so she's a dressmaker. She's the Fortham's only child. So basically, the matriarch was far too busy with the business. She's, see her steely face here, than to get bothered with having more than one child. As such, while Harriet is a very talented dressmaker, her mother has stood in the way of every potential love affair Harriet might have ever had, because she wants to use her daughter's skills to make more money, basically. So Harriet really hates her mother because of that. Then we've got the Elstone's Muslins. So this is the de rigueur fabric for evening gowns, run by Mr. Isaac Elstone, the tailor. By the way, here we have Harriet's picture and stats, the dressmaker. And this is Mr. Isaac Elstone, the tailor at Elstone's Muslins. He cuts a fine figure, dressing impeccably. Many gentlemen come to him for advice, a service he's considering charging for. And he's a greedy, debonair social climber. So watch out for that. Then we have Carlton's Apothecary. So doctors are very expensive. Usually only the very wealthy can deal with them, but they do have Mr. Peter Carlton, son of a middle-class family and dedicated to academic research. He's developed a habit of hunching due to spending so much time over a microscope, something his wife keeps trying to correct. His spectacles are usually found perched upon his head. He's earnest, scholarly, and introverted. We also have Mrs. Jane Carlton, age 32, the apprentice apothecary. She was born with a key intelligence, which is unfortunate for a Regency woman, especially one clever enough to understand how likely her mind was to go to waste until she met Peter. Fortunately, he loved to share his studies with her and showed no condescension based on her gender when he did so. After they fell in love, which was an easy thing for them to do, given that, she had to be the one to pull him into matrimony. So while Peter is the pharmacist, she's become the student and manages the day-to-day business. So she's pretty and intelligent, and unlike many women of the time, she actually gets to use that intelligence to great effect. Then we have Dr. Parsons' surgery and the midwife. So we have Dr. Winston Parsons, age 43. He's the country doctor, a fatherly white man who wags at people for getting ill and offers boiled sweets to encourage them to get better. He's caring in a condescending but well-meaning manner. The doctor's wife, Mrs. Abigail Parsons, look at that face, she's very severe. She's a rather thin white woman who does her best to dress in what she believes the gentry are wearing. She's dismissive of the poor, and she's disdainful and exasperated social climber. Yuck. We have Maggie Ma Hughes, who's the midwife. She's age 68. She's been doing it since she's a young girl. When called to an imminent birth, she simply rolls up her sleeves and says, "Right, let's pop another one out then." She's rather rounded and stocky, with a pleasant smile and calming demeanor. She's a motherly and practical woman and an expert at what she does. Then we have St. Bridget's Church in Terryford, which is run by the Reverend Byron Choke, age 48. He's the vicar. He's a well-fed and red-faced man with lank brown hair, a supercilious expression, and a clear chip on his shoulder. He's quick to judge others as sinful for no other reason than their background, with a penchant for fire and brimstone sermons, and deep-seated jealousy of both Reverend Jennings and Upper Terryford. So beyond Terryford, we get into some of the surrounding estates. So Sand Lake Farm is detailed in one of the adventures, so we'll skip out on that. Tollingate is the Potterton family estate. They're members of the landed gentry, but the estate is too meager to provide well for the family. The family are quite pleasant themselves and are glad of a visit because they've been somewhat snubbed by the more snobby elements of the gentry. And here we have the descriptions of Mr. and Mrs. Potterton. We've got a confused widower. He's distracted, confused, and grieving even after all these years. And then we have Miss Marianne Potterton. She was 11 years old when her mother died. Realizing she's become an old maid without ever really having been come out, she's angry about her situation. So she's kind of looking after her poor father. And then we have Mr. George Potterton, the heir apparent at age 22. He's a romantic and a talented mathematician. That's interesting. He tries his best to act how he thinks his stuffy father should, but he's not very good at it. His younger siblings make fun of him. Then we have Miss Clara Potterton. She is a self-educated, independently minded bookworm, polite and quiet. She begins reading whenever she feels she's paid enough attention to company. Then we have Susan Potterton, a hopeless romantic. She's utterly charming to outsiders, but selfish and inconsiderate where her family is concerned, and never lifts a finger if someone else is there to do something. At age 14, we have Master Charles Potterton, this little guy. He's a rebellious, attention-seeking troublemaker. And finally, we have Miss Lucy Potterton, age 13, manipulator. She's outwardly sweet and adorable, but manipulative and clever. Everything about Lucy's an act to maintain her cherubic reputation, and she's so good at this that the cracks rarely show. Then we have Charlton Abbey. So they're not as wealthy as the Northlake family, but the Asher family claim a very good fortune from the Charlton Abbey estate. They have 3 children, 2 elder daughters and 1 young son, and the eldest daughter is out. So as far as the Potterton family, we have some stats here for Mr. Henry and Miss Marianne, as well as the children and the heir apparent. Then we have a closer in view. Actually, I guess this is Terryton in the surrounding area, yeah. So we have Pendlehaven Woods, the nearby village of Bungford that was mentioned, where some laborers live, and then some key points of interest like Sand Lake Farm, Charlton Abbey, various estates where people live outside of the town. So within Charlton Abbey, we have Mr. Richard Asher, age 42, is the lord of the manor. He's dedicated and somewhat tedious with his Bible studies, but he practices what he preaches, taking care to be kind and generous to those he meets. Conflicted mother, Mrs. Chandra Asher, age 35. She's a bored and lonely matchmaker and desperately wants to get her daughters married and made this her mission in life. So then we have Miss Eleanor Asher, one of those daughters. She's the one who's out, but she's religious, snobbish, and uncompromising. Everything is simply not good enough for her, and she sighs constantly at the state of the world. She dresses severely in styles that are much too old for her, though the quality of her fabrics is always high. Then we have Miss Julia Asher at 16. She's also dedicated in her faith, and she's a charitable sister. But she's not out yet, it seems. She's a generous and passionate activist. Any money she is given always ends up in the hands of a local charity. She regularly visits the ill and takes food to poor families. Isn't that lovely? And then we finally have Master Philip Asher at age 14, the dithering heir. He's very polite and well-mannered, but he's perpetually confused and has no conversational skills. He doesn't even know how to begin a conversation. So there we go. Then we have Mortview House, a dark and foreboding place on the western edge of Terryford, which is usually left alone. It stands empty for the moment as its owner, Mr. Valentine Williams, recently died. In the late summer of 1814, the main residents were a brother and sister of Valentine's children, Robert and Diana. The estate grants a tidy income, but the Williamses, historically speaking, have not been prone to showing off their wealth. Siblings are the subject of considerable gossip when they arrive for several reasons, due to their family's history, the circumstances surrounding their father's death, and the fact that they're outsiders. You'll know more about them during the adventure, The Emptiness Within. Then we have Stornley House, the estate of the Havering family, who bought the manor many years ago with money made in trade. So they're nouveau riche, these folks, which will be scaring local gentry. Stornley is one of the oldest manors in the area and has a fascinating history and heritage, but it's not very fashionable. The Havering family have tried to buy up Stornley House to show off how they've entered the upper classes, but they not quite got hold of the fashions of the era, I suppose. So the master of the house, Mr. Havering, he's ebullient, down-to-earth, and bored. Slightly hypocritically, he dismisses those who have inherited fortunes possessing no real work ethic, so is impressed with those who prove themselves to have some gumption. The youngest daughter, Mrs. Havering, she's a noblewoman who's resigned herself to spinsterhood. She's a well-mannered, house-proud socialite. Then we have the Upper Terryford Church. So here we have the Reverend Samuel Jennings, the local vicar. He's an average-looking black man with a pleasant, welcoming demeanor. He's always neat, but rarely fashionable or stylish. He's a helpful man of faith, albeit one who is struggling to deal with his own grief. So only a year after he took over his position, his elder sister Grace, who lived some distance away, died of influenza. They were very close and death hit him hard. Poor guy. So then we get into the adventures. So really that's, I know I spent a lot of time on 78 pages, but I really love this source book. I'll quickly flip through the adventures so you can see, I mean, there's, a lot to learn about Terryford. There's quite a lot of interesting and additional NPCs. There's loads of great handouts, as always. You've got floor plans, you've got dances, you've got social intrigue, you've got mythos intrigue, you've got weird stuff, you've got creatures, you've got oddness. You get to learn more about the Northlake family, who dominate the gentry. You even get family trees and stuff to look through and try and investigate what's going on with the family. Loads and loads of cool stuff. There's some new spells, there's monsters, NPCs. Then the Emptiness Within as well. So the veil between worlds is much thinner in Terryford than everywhere else in Wiltshire. Almost 2,000 years ago, the area was under the influence of a dark entity known by those who worshipped it as the Emptiness. So that's kind of the setup for this one. Again, you'll be kind of viewing all of this through the lens of the Regency period. And there's quite a detailed timeline here as well, which I don't want to sort of leave on screen for too long. A lot of interesting characters in this one as well, and a few different ways to start the scenario. You get mysterious illnesses, there's hidden cellars and tunnels, there's bizarre temples, there's, you quickly dig below the shiny surface of the wealthy gentry and get down to the gross business of what they're really up to in these creepy abandoned homes and chambers and so forth. You can see, there's some creepy stuff going on, night gaunts, who knows what else. But yeah, the adventures in here are really good, with hosts and hostility as well. You really got spoiled for choice for good Regency scenarios. I do hope they come out with a whole book of new Regency scenarios. I think the era is so rich. Dealing with all the etiquette and reputation stuff is really cool. And now we get into our pre-generated characters, by the way. So first we have the main character sheet, and then we have pulp adjustments. So they get what pulp talents they would get and their adjustments. So raising their POW, higher sanity, hit points, etc. So we have James Bennett, who's a 22-year-old poet. We have Georgiana Wentworth, a sensible elder sister. And as you can see, she's dealing with arts and crafts, piano, language, English and French, that kind of stuff. Then we have Emma Wentworth, an excitable younger sister. She is, what is she? She can do a bit of shooting. That's pretty good. Can the other sister shoot? No, she can brawl and dodge, as can Mr. James Bennett. Then we have Captain John Stone, an army officer, so he has brawl, cavalry saber skills, flintlock pistols, flintlock rifles, and a good dodge. So that's pretty dang good. Then we have the Reverend Samuel Jennings, who we met in the Terryford section as well, the local vicar. Yeah, he's got not much in the way of fighting skills, but he's great with language. He's good with things like library use, listening, persuading, and religion, of course, at 70%. Then we have Miss Jane Radcliffe, enterprising con artist. It's interesting. So she's good with psychology and charm, art and crafts of acting. That's quite useful. She can also shoot, which is helpful if you're going to be a female criminal type. Yeah, pretty cool. And now we get into the useful background tables and miscellaneous. So sample equipment costs, again, given in the old style of pounds, shillings, and pence. You know, giving you an idea of the typical incomes for different classes of society. This is really useful, actually, a glossary of Regency costumes. So different types of things that people would wear, which, you know, fashion is often a topic of conversation at balls. You need to know that stuff. Then you get your Regency weapons. So you have melee and range weapons, including blackjack, bow and arrows, large and small clubs, garrots, medium and small knives, spears, heavy, light, and medium, small swords, wood axes. Then we have, for firearms, a fairly limited selection. You've got the blunderbuss, a flintlock musket, flintlock pistol, double-barreled flintlock pistol, a flintlock rifle, and a shotgun for fouling. You can see they do much less damage than shotguns in the 1920s. And the blunderbuss is huge and unwieldy, but does quite a bit of damage. But really, the muskets and rifles are the most deadly. But, you know, the advantage of a flintlock pistol is they're easily concealed, but they are very slow to load. So basically, if you're in combat, you want to try and hit with your shots. Pick your moments. Reloading takes quite a long time. Then we have some details about Terryford a century later, if you want to get into, you know, the future of the area. So we've got new people running all the businesses. The town has expanded. There's a tea shop, a library, a post office. There's a new school, butchers, greengrocers, lots of changes. And then we've got all the collected maps and handouts. So this is a player-safe map, for example, with none of the GM stuff on it. So these are, of course, available as separate PDFs as well from Chaosium when you buy the book over there. And then we have a copy of the character sheet, so just so you get a full screen view here. And again, you can see we've got, you know, some of the new skills like astronomy, natural philosophy. Mesmerism is not on here, but you can put it on there if the GM allows it. You've got a firearms pistol and firearms rifle and blunderbuss instead of a normal one. Then you have this new reputation track, so you've got starting, current, and the censure score. So basically, whenever your reputation changes, you should make sure that you don't hit the censure barrier, which is 1/5 of your starting reputation on that day. If you lose 1/5 of your starting reputation in a day, you become censured, and you have to tick that box and suffer the consequences. And pretty much all the rest of the sheet is the same as you would find in any other variant of Call of Cthulhu. And there's also a pulp version as well, which puts the pulp logo there and gives you space for pulp towns and stuff like that. So there you go. That is the Regency Era for Call of Cthulhu. I could think of no better way to start off this month of Halloween Terrors. I think it's a wonderful book. You know, I know I went into a lot of detail and minutia in the beginning of the book, but there's a surprising amount of info packed in the first 78 pages. The Terryford setting is really detailed as well, so it gives you a lot to start with, even if you're not that familiar with the Regency period. I basically really strongly recommend the book if you have any interest in that period in history, or if you just want to mix things up and be in an era of Call of Cthulhu where not only do you not have cell phones or any of that stuff like in the 1920s, but you have to get everywhere by horse and carriage, and, you know, traveling by night or being a woman by themselves are quite dangerous, let alone when you're dealing with mythos entities and, you know, things beyond the realm of normal, mortal, mundane affairs. So I think it's a really great change of pace. It's really well written, and I've gotten a hell of a lot of use out of it, so I strongly recommend it. Next time, we'll take a look at some more Call of Cthulhu setting books and key supplements that I would recommend. So, in particular, Cult of Cthulhu and the Malleus Monstrorum slipcase set as well, which I think are critical for any budding keeper. So look out for those videos coming soon. In the meantime, take care, enjoy the rest of Halloween month, and I shall see you soon in the next video. All right, take care, and bye-bye.